I often, I've been pointing out during this Advent season how too often we automatically think that the incarnation is about the Son of God coming down from heaven, which is not wrong, except of course it's not up there and doesn't come down. But anyway, many of the other scripture texts, Isaiah 11, a shoot shall sprout from the stump of Jesse, and the earth will give forth its fruit. Justice shall spring forth from the earth, the Psalm says. That a sprout will come from. So it's coming up from the earth. Jesus is coming up from our stock, not just coming down from heaven, but coming up into our humanity, such as it is. Again, too often in our spiritual life, we've been trained, the spiritual life is about becoming more spiritual, which means, getting away from the human, going up to some angelic spiritual space. You have to go up, and away from, this human mess down here. Well, what happens if we do that? We meet God coming down in the other direction and saying, where are you going? I'm coming down into your humanity. What are you trying to get away from it for? How do you think you're going to find me if you're escaping from what I'm coming into? So, ironically, we Christians, aren't very, skilled in this, realizing that it's precisely in our humanity that we find God, and not anywhere else, as if it could be anywhere else. So, luckily, we find God there. And in case you haven't noticed, our humanity is kind of messy. One priest friend of mine told me a story recently about a homily he gave about Jesus needing Pampers, and how a couple of people came up to him after the homily and were very angry and said, the Son of God doesn't need diapers. Well, what do you think he needed? The point is, the messiness of our humanity is what he took on. And if you look around or look inside, our humanity is plenty messy, and if anything more than ever today with the pandemic and the election and work, people out of work and economic, so do we need to escape from that if we're going to find God? Well, no, absolutely not. Not if we believe the incarnation. It's in the messiness that we find God. I'm always struck every year, every cycle when we have these readings about how God fulfills his promises to David. We heard in the first reading in the book of Samuel how he said, never mind building me a house, I'm going to build you a house, I'm going to build you a dynasty, and you always have someone, your house and your dynasty will last forever. Which is quite a promise to make to, a backwater king in, some little country, thousands of years ago. Really? Well, how did that work out? Well, David's grandson, Rehoboam, split the country in two, so that was the end of the unified kingdom, Israel and Judah. So that didn't work out very well. And then, if you go further down, the Psalm 89 that we have today, it's a very long psalm. If you go to the second part of the psalm, after God makes all these promises, to the king, he will call me his father, he will be a son to me. Could be a prophecy of Jesus coming. Then you have, scholars think that this psalm was written around the time of when Josiah, the king Josiah, at the end of the 7th century BC, who was a very righteous, dynamic king, was killed in battle against Egypt. And the psalm says, where are your promises now? Here we have this wonderful king who is righteous, and then you knock him off? Now what's going to happen? Wretched as we are in this human condition, the psalm goes on to say. Well, a few decades later, his own offspring, had to yield. They were carried away to Babylon. That was the end of the Davidic line in terms of actually reigning as kings in the Babylonian captivity. Okay, so where's the promise now, God? The kings aren't even on the throne anymore. Some promise. Isn't that like what we often are tempted maybe to say to God ourselves? Where's your mercy? Where's your presence? Where's your promise now, God? Look what's happening to me. Look what's happening to us. And that's nonetheless where God is hidden. If you look at the genealogy in the first chapter of Matthew, you have the Babylonian captivity, and then centuries, 5 centuries of nobodies. But they were in the Davidic line, and then they go all the way down to Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born the Christ. And Joseph, son of David, is mentioned in the gospel today, betrothed to a man of the house of David whose name was Joseph. And this is the way God fulfilled his promise to David, the coming of the Christ through an unknown woman and an unknown man in some backwater. And that was the Son of God. And even then, how did that work out? Mary couldn't have understood everything that was, supposedly said to her in this version of the Annunciation, as if she knew this was the Son of God in the strict sense that we understand today. Of course she didn't know that. A little bit later in the same Gospel of Luke, there she is in Jerusalem, and Jesus tells her at the age of 12, here I must be in my Father's house, and she didn't understand that, according to the Gospel. Well, then she didn't know what was going on. We don't grasp how God is working in our lives. Even Mary didn't grasp. She pondered these things in her heart and had to adapt moment by moment to what was revealed. Totally unexpectedly, with the virgin birth and everything that followed. And then how did it work out for Jesus? Well, you see behind me how it worked out for Jesus. So much for the kingdom. Wasn't an earthly kingdom, obviously. But then he was raised and became, as we celebrate the Feast of Christ the King, King of the whole universe. So, what do we learn from this? We learn that there's a mystery, as the second reading says, a mystery that was kept silent or hidden for generations, literally, hidden from us in our own lives very often, but then manifest and made known gradually in God's way and in God's time. And the cross is a perfect example of what we learn, that God works through the messiness, the weakness, the failure, the suffering. That's not an obstacle to God. The messiness of our humanity is not an obstacle. God uses it. God makes all things work together for the good. We don't just... Our temptation is to flee from our humanity, and especially its failures and its weaknesses and its betrayals. But that's not how God works. God works through the failures and the weakness and the betrayals. That's how it works. The messiness of our humanity is where we find God, in the messiness, and not in spite of the messiness. That's the lesson we learn from all those generations and through the history of Christ and through our own history. We should be learning this. And if Christ becomes King of the universe precisely through that, well, then not only does God work through the messiness, but what's made manifest and made known, to use the language of the second reading, is that God's plan always works infinitely more magnificently, unexpectedly than we could ever imagine. So those are the two surprises. From a naive or superficial understanding of God's promises, we come to it's precisely through all the seeming failures of the promises that God actually accomplishes purpose, and that purpose is always infinitely more magnificent than we could ever have imagined for our own life and for the life of the planet and the universe. So that should give us faith, give us confidence, and give us hope that we can emerge from this, that God's promises will be fulfilled. Not in spite of the present situation in our own lives, or the lives of the country, or the lives of the planet, but because of it and through it. And that what will come beyond it, that will come from it, through it, is infinitely more magnificent than anything we could ever have imagined. That's what happened to Jesus. And we're supposed to be his followers and believers in him. Whatever happened to him is going to happen to us. I repeat, whatever happened to him is going to happen to us. We'll go through death, but we'll come to resurrection. He's the pattern. And he's the guide, and he's the helper. So, as we approach the darkest night of the year, in a few days, and the darkest time of our time these days, let's remember that God is working through that. God is with us in the messiness of the humanity that is ours, and that God is working in it and through it and not in spite of it, and that God will lead us through it to a fulfillment we could never, ever have imagined.